Welcome back. What is the Yellow Vest movement? Some of its 110,000 members have been protesting in 52 major cities across Canada. They're speaking out about the need to reduce immigration, pull out of the United Nations Migration Pact, and stop carbon taxes. Some warn that it's a vehicle of hate. Others say the fear is exaggerated. Azeezah Kanji joins us to share her perspective. She's a lawyer and director of programming at the Noor Cultural Centre. Azeezah, so glad to have you join us to talk about this very important and timely topic. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me, Sophia.
So, this group has been called by so many different names. I mean, it's now United We Roll. It used to be the Yellow Vest Convoy, and it's part of the Yellow Vest movement. Can you tell us how it arose? Where did it come from?
So the Yellow Vest movement in Canada is often understood as being inspired by the Yellow Vest movement in France, which arose as a movement of protest against escalating gas prices and more generally about economic disparities and neoliberal policies of austerity that were causing tremendous economic deprivation. However, what we see in the Canadian context is something that's fundamentally different from the movement as it arose and has developed in France.
What's the difference? What's the major difference?
So in the French context, we saw support for the movement from across a broad variety of political perspectives, including leftists and progressives, and many of their demands were oriented around measures that would actually help alleviate economic disparities, right? So measures to do with fair wages and pensions. What we see in the Canadian context is completely different. Much of the official rhetoric around the Yellow Vest movement has had to do with pro-pipeline and anti-immigrant claims. And then in the actual protests, as well as their social media presence, we see a pervasive racism, misogyny, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, as well as things like death threats against politicians, including the Prime Minister, death threats against Muslims, descriptions of racialized people and immigrants as being subhuman and scum. We've seen
comments about MPs as well.
Comments about MPs, yeah. as well as the Prime Minister, right, accusing him of treason, calling for the death penalty against him. We've seen conspiracy theories, things like the Fort McMurray fire was actually started by Muslims because they wanted to build a super mosque on the ashes of it. We've seen adherents of the Yellow Vest movement previously being arrested for aiming live weapons at RCMP officers and stockpiling weapons. So we see a wide variety of appeals to extremely bigoted ideologies accompanied by threats to violence, which really distinguish it from any kind of legitimate movement for economic justice. And because we have to recognize that in Canada, poverty is extremely racialized. The communities with some of the highest rates of poverty in Canada are Indigenous communities who are impoverished by the continuing theft of their land and resources, including for the benefit of pipeline projects that the Yellow Vest movement is advocating for. We have very significant racialized wage gaps in Canada that continue to ensure that Indigenous and racialized communities live in poverty. And so any movement that's genuinely oriented towards alleviating economic injustice would actually have to put addressing racism at the center of its movement instead of appealing to racism in order to continue its logic of divide and conquer and appealing to certain people's white privilege in order to give them a sense of empowerment instead of addressing the actual causes that lie behind economic disadvantage in the country.
Azeezah, how would you respond to some of the comments that I've seen organizers make that they're saying, we're not racist, and these are fringe elements within our group, and like any other movement, there will be elements like this, and we can't necessarily control it because they're not a centralized, there's no centralized leadership. So they're saying, think about the issues and, forget about the racist aspects of it.
People say that about people who support Donald Trump too, that they're really being motivated by economic issues. But study after serious study has found that the actual motivating factors have more to do with appeals to racism and white supremacy than they do with economic disparities. When you look at who the organizers are of many of these Yellow Vest protests that have been occurring across Canada, they're movements that are fundamentally and centrally dedicated to anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, and neo-Nazi logic. Groups like the 3%ers, which is an armed paramilitary group that's very active in the West, groups like Soldiers of Odin, groups like the Worldwide Coalition Against Islam. So their racist rhetoric and actions are really inseverable from the rest of what it is that they're claiming. And I think the fact that many in the media as well as security agencies are willing to give them such a benefit of the doubt when it comes to attributing some kind of legitimate economic grievance and program to what it is that they're doing really speaks to a fundamental disparity in the way that while Muslim communities are consistently stigmatized as sources of danger and violence, there's a tremendous amount of willingness to allow far-right and these extreme racist movements a tremendous amount of space to organize and articulate their demands in the Canadian public sphere.
Where do these anti-immigrant sentiments come from? Because, we look at the state in the United States and we say, okay, we're different from them. But then on the other hand, we have this movement, 110,000 members in one month, protesting across more than 50 cities. What's going on here? What's happening to Canada? Or has it always been the case that this is our Canada?
So Canada has a very long history of racially discriminatory immigration policies so that non-preferred races, i.e. non-white people, weren't allowed into Canada except as indentured labor. And this was official Canadian policy for much of its history until the official state adoption of multiculturalism policy as the guiding policy behind Canadian immigration. But even so, there has always been a very significant percentage of Canadians that have been uncomfortable with people of color immigrating to Canada and who sustain this idea that Canada is really a white people's country. And this is even then deployed against the Indigenous people of this land. So in some of the Yellow Vest protests, we've seen that when Indigenous land and water protectors have come out in opposition to these movements, people like Faith Goldie, who was a neo-Nazi who was a speaker at some of these rallies, told these indigenous people, well, if you don't like it, this is our country, go back home, as if this hasn't been their land for thousands of years that the Canadian Settler Project has been committed to erasing. So I don't think it's surprising that you would then see this latent racist anti-immigrant sentiment being organized and coalesced, particularly at this moment in our history when overt racism and white supremacy has been given a facade of legitimacy with the rise of extreme right political movements throughout the world, from the United States to Europe to Latin America.
How concerned should we be about this movement and other movements in Canada?
So I think this movement is troubling on a couple of levels. First is the fact that we're now seeing all of these different right-wing and racist groups, which previously were sort of represented as being fractious and not allied, that they're now uniting under a common umbrella. And I think that this really challenges the idea that's prevalent in much of our state national security discourse, that right-wing and white supremacists, that they're not really an organized threat, that much of their violence is individual and sporadic. We know from the research of academics like Barbara Perry, who specializes in ideological violence, that this hasn't been true for a long time, that there there are, more than 100 organized right-wing and white supremacist groups across Canada, even while the analysis of our national security agencies continues to deny it. So we know that that hasn't been true for a while, but this becoming even more obvious with the coalescence of all of these groups under the Yellow Vest movement umbrella. And then the second level on which it's troubling is that I think it speaks to the extreme to the reluctance to treat right-wing and white supremacist violence as a serious threat, and in fact, many state parties actually endorse their violence and their extremely ideologically bigoted rhetoric.
Can you explain what you mean by that? Like state parties endorsing? That sounds really strong. Tell me what you mean by that.
So leaders of political parties, like the federal Conservative leader Andrew Scheer, as well as the leader of the People's Party of Canada, Maxime Bernier, addressed the convoy rally in Ottawa. The rally was also addressed by Faith Goldy, who's a prominent neo-Nazi white supremacist in Canada, and yet they seem to have no problem speaking at the same rally as figures who are so infamous for their racism as Faith Goldy, and they didn't even condemn it. The RCMP provided an escort for the convoy as it was leaving Alberta, and we've seen this happening before. For example, when the Worldwide Coalition Against Islam organized a rally in Nathan Phillips Square, Toronto police provided an escort for the racist protesters and allowed them safe passage through City Hall, even while they used brutality against the anti-racist protesters who came out to oppose them. I was told by a policeman that, well, the people who are really engaging in hateful rhetoric is the anti-racist protesters, because they were using slogans that were critical of police. And so we have almost this complete reversal of reality, where the people who are consistently being focused on as the national security threats are marginalized and racialized populations, who are the very ones who are vulnerable to the violence by groups like the Yellow Vest movement and all of these other constituent groups that compose them, but who are consistently marginalized in our state rhetoric as posing a real threat, even though we know that far from only being active online, as they're represented in Public Safety Canada reports, they've been conducting live fire paramilitary training exercises, mosque stakeouts, border patrols, and have been responsible for more than 9 times more deaths in Canada than Muslims have since 9/11.
Lots more we could talk about, Azeezah, but we have to end there. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sophia.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.